Hello students, this is Professor McDermott. Our topic in this lecture is the Industrial Revolution in Europe, focusing especially on Great Britain, which was really the first nation to industrialize and the guiding force behind industrialization. We're also going to talk about how the economic power that Britain gained during the Industrial Revolution helped to finance their expansion and their building of an enormous colonial empire throughout the world. But first, in order to understand the Industrial Revolution, which starts in the later part of the 1700s, we need to understand how goods were produced in England before the Industrial Revolution, before the factory system took hold, before large machines were deployed in industry. The period just before the Industrial Revolution, historians have called the Industrious Revolution. Why? Because people were working really hard and the economy was growing. But they were still using more traditional methods of production before machines and factories. So let's talk about this industrious revolution that lasted through the 17th century and up until the late 18th century. And let's focus on the textile industry, that is, the clothing industry, and discuss how a shirt would have been produced during this industrious revolution, before the Industrial Revolution. Well, the main place where the production of a shirt would have been organized was a workshop, which could have been in any British city or town. Now, a workshop was run by a master clothier, and working for him, he had some employees who were called journeymen, and below them also usually teenagers or very young men who were trying to learn the clothing trade from the master. We call them apprentices. In the workshop, the master, the journeyman, and the apprentices all lived and worked together. But not all the steps in producing a shirt took place in the workshop. First, the master clothier would get raw materials like cotton or wool, and then to turn those into thread, he would farm them out to a spinner. Now, a spinner was usually a farm wife who happened to have one of those old-fashioned spinning wheels that were operated with pedals by the feet. You may have seen one of those in a museum, perhaps. And so the spinner would turn the cotton or the wool into spools of thread, and then she would return the thread to the workshop. The next step was to send the thread out to a weaver. Now, a weaver was often a man, sometimes a woman. This would have been a person who owned a loom for producing cloth. And usually, again, these were often farmers or farm wives working in their homes on a loom, turning the thread into cloth, at which point the cloth went back to the workshop. Um, the next phase saw the master sending out the cloth to a number of different seamstresses. These were women who were experts at sewing. Furthermore, the different seamstresses would make different parts of the shirt. So there might be one seamstress who specialized in making sleeves in her home in between her other chores on the farm, and another seamstress would make the front and the back of the shirt, and then a third seamstress might just focus on making the collars of the shirt. And once all those pieces were made, they would be sent back to the workshop where the master, the journeyman, and the apprentices would assemble them into a shirt. Now, what do you notice about this process of production, pre-industrial? Well, the first and very important aspect is that everybody involved in this process is working at home. Even the journeymen and apprentices, as I mentioned, lived with the master. They were normally unmarried men And so they would live with the master. The master's wife would usually feed them, and everybody in the workshop would eat their meals together. After work, they would drink beer together and socialize together. So they knew each other very well. And the seamstresses, the weaver, and the spinners, like I said, were also working from their homes. You see in this process that there was some specialization of tasks. Different tasks were farmed out to different people. We call this a division of labor. It's a way to increase efficiency, of course, in industry. Um, but because these people were working at home, they were not spending their entire day making collars or spinning thread. Um, they would only spend part of the day doing that. And let's say, for instance, a farm wife who was a spinner, in between spinning on her wheel, she would take care of the kids, cook dinner, maybe work in the garden, milk the cows, and so forth. So she's doing different tasks throughout the day rather than just working as a spinner. Now, obviously, this was really hard work. um, the people that were working at home had many, many things that they had to do during the day in order to survive. And so they were really working from the time they got up till the time they went to bed. However, they did get to do different tasks throughout the day. And that gave them a feeling that they had some variety, at least, in their lives. They were interacting, for instance, with kids, or wives interacting with their husbands. Um, and that did tend to break up the routine a little bit. Also, of course, um, you might have a quota for the day, like a seamstress might have to produce 20 collars in a certain day to get her full pay, but she could choose when during the day she would make those collars. So, in a way, all of these workers are setting their own schedules, and it's somewhat flexible. It's quite interesting that it's only in very recent years that employers have gotten back to allowing workers to work at home, and of course that has to do with the computer revolution, making it possible for people to telecommute from their homes. So people are finally, once again, starting to enjoy that privilege of working at home in their pajamas. And in fact, what I'm doing now is sitting at my desk at home recording this lecture. So I suppose for at least part of my day, I have this privilege as well. Um, but all of this whole method of production was about to change in the British textile industry, and the change started between 1763 and 1775 when the Scottish inventor James Watt developed and perfected the steam engine. Now, previously, um, it was very difficult to create a large factory because the only kind of power available to power big machines in a factory, um, uh, two kinds of power: water and wind. All right, so you could put a factory or a machine next to a windmill, you could put it next to a fast running stream, and the stream would turn paddle wheels, and that would turn a turbine, and that could operate some kind of machine. For instance, millers, people that ground flour and meal, um, put their mills next to streams, and they were run by water power. But these sources of power were limited in their applications. But when James Watt invented the steam engine, which was run by coal, burning and turning a turbine, this meant that you could have bigger and better machines, and furthermore, you could put them anywhere you wanted. You didn't have to have a stream or a windmill. You could start to create larger factories with machines powered by these steam engines. And so new machines almost immediately begin to appear that really make thread production especially more efficient. The spinning jenny of 1764, the water frame of 1769, and the spinning mule of 1799 were all machines powered by the steam engine um, that would produce much larger quantities of thread at a time than a lone woman sitting at her spinning wheel. So instead of one spool of thread at a time, they might produce 64 spools of thread at a time. And this made a huge difference, obviously. Then power looms began to be invented as well. And so this is the onset of heavy machinery in the British textile industry. Another very important machine that really revolutionized textile production was the cotton gin, which was invented by an American, Eli Whitney, in 1793. Now, Eli Whitney was from Massachusetts, but he had friends who lived actually near Savannah, Georgia, and so he went to visit them, and he watched as the slaves, who obviously were responsible for producing the cotton on Georgia plantations, went through the laborious process of picking out the seeds from the bolls of cotton. And they had to do this by hand with little combs or picks, because cotton is full of these tiny little seeds. And it was a very labor intensive process, took a long time, and that really made cotton much less profitable because you had to put so much labor into getting these seeds out. Well, Whitney, being a clever man, said, I can invent a machine that will do this much more efficiently. And so he invented the cotton gin, or cotton engine. And you see in the little cartoon here, it was possible then to just turn a crank, and behold, suddenly large amounts of cotton can be processed very quickly. The cotton gin took out the seeds. And this made cotton production much more profitable. In a way, it really made the state of Georgia in terms of its prosperity, and it guaranteed that cotton plantations would then spread westward to places like Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, and Texas. And so, unwittingly, what Whitney had done was to really promote and support the slave system. That was not his intention, but it really made slavery, and especially cotton planting, much more profitable in the South. But it also meant that British textile manufacturers now had a huge, reliable source of cotton flowing into the British Isles that they could then use to make into cloth. And so there was a real incentive to make cloth production much more efficient, so as to handle this much larger volume of cotton that was now available. And so, really beginning about the turn of the 1800s, you start to see factories being built, and and clothing production moving into larger factories. And this meant the end of the old workshop system of production. And what happened was that those master workmen who were prosperous enough to afford the new machines would buy those machines, set up factories, and they would become factory owners, or what we call capitalists, people that had a lot of capital, that is money, and they moved up into the middle class. But their former employees, along with poorer masters who couldn't afford the new machines, tended to fall down and become common laborers, and very often they would have to get low-paying jobs in these new factories. So they became part of the new working class of Great Britain in the textile industry. So, what can we say about the new factory system that developed during what we can now call the Industrial Revolution, excuse me, in England, which later spread, of course, to the rest of Europe and to America? Well, in factories, you could have much more specialization of labor. All right, so you would have a much more elaborate division of labor, and usually each worker in a factory would have the same repetitive task that he did for the entire day. And these were very long days, and we're talking about 12, 13, sometimes 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, working in these factories. And it could be somewhat mind-numbing simply doing the same very mechanical motion over and over again all day. So this was a real adjustment for people that had been used to having a variety of tasks to do. Um, Another big change that came with the factory system was that suddenly it became necessary to leave your house in order to go to work. Formerly, everybody worked at home, but now you had to leave your home and go to the factory. And this applied not just to men, but to lower class women and even large numbers of children who were also working in the factories. One reason for that was that if mom and dad were both working in the factory, they couldn't leave their kids at home all day unsupervised, so they would often get them jobs too, so that they could at least keep an eye on them. Another reason, of course, was that it brought in more income for the family. So you got men, women, and children leaving home to go to work. Obviously, this has a big impact on home life. It has a big impact on education because clearly, if children are working in a factory and they worked, in many cases, the same long hours that their parents did, they're not able to go to school. And finally, it means that children working in factories didn't inherit the same skill sets as, say, a farm child would. Now, a farmer's son would know how to plow, he would know how to take care of horses. A farmer's daughter would know how to garden, how to cook, how to make cloth often, or spin, or what have you. But as children work in the factories, they just learn one kind of very repetitive task that they do all day. The little boy in the picture here is what was called a bobbin boy. And this little boy's job all day, every day, was simply to take the spools of thread, completed spools of thread, off this large spinning machine, carry them over to a basket, and drop them in the basket. That was it. Now, it wasn't very hard work. In some ways, children were very well suited to this, but at the same time, it didn't leave them very employable anywhere except in the textile industry. And of course, in many cases, they're not learning to read and write. And also, this kind of work could sometimes be dangerous. Whenever I look at this picture, I'm always afraid this little boy is going to get one of his feet caught in this giant machine and maybe get it chopped off. And of course, there was no workers' comp. There was no health insurance. There were no pensions. And so if you got injured on the job, really, you were just out of luck, and you might be unemployable. Another big change with the onset of the factory system was that instead of being paid by the task, say the number of collars or sleeves you produced in a day, you were paid by the hour. Now, that's something that we really take for granted. But it was something very new in the 1800s, and it really brought about a major shift in the way people thought about time. They had to become a lot more disciplined in terms of their work habits, and they had to pay much closer attention to what time it was. This is why the greatest gift that you could give a working man was a watch, so that he could really keep track of what time it was, because it suddenly mattered. When you're a farmer, it doesn't matter if you milk Bessie the cow at 7:57 a.m. or 8:04 a.m. She doesn't care. But if you're working in a factory, you have to be there by 8 a.m. It really, really matters. The difference between 7:57 and 8:04, you might lose your job if you showed up at 8:04. So this is the beginning of that real obsession with time that many of us have even today in this post-industrial society. Well, it should be said that this process of change, this industrial revolution, was a slow and gradual process. Some countries like Britain industrialized more rapidly. Others took decades, really, to industrialize, and there are countries in the world today that right now are going through the Industrial Revolution. So really, this has been a very long process that's still ongoing. But it had a huge impact on human life in the places that became industrialized. The great French political theorist Alexis de Tocqueville made this comment about the effects of working in a factory. He said, quote, "When a craftsman spends all his time on the fabrication of a single object, he acquires a singular skill in his work. However, he also loses the overall ability to concentrate his mind on his task. He becomes more skillful and less industrious every day. And we might say that as the work is perfected, the individual worker is degraded." Excuse me. What can we expect from a person who has spent 20 years of his life making penheads? And then what good is the powerful human intellect that so often has moved the world in such a person, except to find a better way to make penheads? As the principle of the division of labor is applied more completely, the worker becomes weaker, more constrained, and more dependent. The master and the laborer have nothing in common in this picture, and every day they grow apart. End quote. So clearly, Tocqueville thinks that even though industry is becoming more efficient and more productive, individual workers, because they're sentenced to do these boring and repetitive tasks every day, all day, are becoming dehumanized in a sense. They're losing something of what it means to be human. Now, it should be said that factory workers were often deeply grateful for these jobs, and there was a major demand for these factory jobs wherever they appeared. We might want to take this with a grain of salt, but whether you agree with Alexis de Tocqueville or not, I think his last statement is undoubtedly accurate. The master and the laborer have nothing in common in this picture, and every day they grow apart. Why is that? Well, formerly masters and workers lived together, they worked together, they shared their lives together in a very meaningful way. But with the new factory system, the capitalists hardly ever saw their employees, they didn't mingle or interact with them, and also they lived in separate neighborhoods. Okay, so as they became wealthier, factory owners and their wives and kids would move out of their old workshops, and they would move to a nice new neighborhood where other rich people congregated. And similarly, poor people now were segregated in a sense into their own poor neighborhoods. And so there was very little contact between masters and workers, and that led to the sense of different classes. The middle class, which we call the bourgeoisie, versus the working class. And we'll see how this growing sense of class division would ripen into conflict later in European history. But right now I want to talk about the effect of the new factory system on gender relations between men and women. Now, what I'm about to say really only applied to middle class people, the capitalists, the factory owners, okay? Because working class women and children, as we've seen, were often working in the factories, and farmers were still working at home. But for middle class people, they would have to leave their wives in the morning to go to their factory, and that meant that the wives were at home all day in the household, taking care of the business of the home, or at least supervising it if they had servants, the cooking, the cleaning, and the child care, while the men were out in public, in the public sphere, taking care of business and interacting with the broader world. And it was really during this period that you get the sense that there's this stark separation between men and women, that men's place is out in public, that's their sphere, and women's place is really in the home, and that sphere belongs to them. Now, this idea had existed in some form throughout European history, but it really becomes much sharper and better defined when men start leaving the home to go to work. And it should be said that even though women were in a sense confined to the home for much of their lives, This was considered to be a very important task that was worthy of respect, especially the bringing up and educating of children, which became the main job of these housewives and mothers. And so gradually there developed an idea that women had to stay home because, in a way, they were too good, they were too tender-hearted, they were too delicate, they were too moral, in a way, too good to go outside the house. If they went outside the house, they would be shocked by the poverty, the degradation, the dog eat dog world of business. And so women had to stay home because they were somehow purer, more moral, and even in a sense better than men. And so there evolved the idea of what was called the angel in the house, that the mother, the wife, was almost like a superior, almost like an angelic being who was too pure to go outside. And so you see a sharper definition of gender roles here emerging during the Industrial Revolution. In a way, the great icon of middle class motherhood was none other than the ruler of Great Britain, starting in 1837, Queen Victoria. And you see here in this picture Queen Victoria with her husband Prince Albert and some of their 9 children. Now, if you look at this picture, it's very interesting. I wish we were in a classroom right now because I would love to hear your responses to this. But if you look at this picture, does she look like a queen? She's not wearing a crown or furs or robes. She's really wearing the ordinary clothes that a middle class housewife would have worn in her time. And furthermore, she's surrounded by children. She's got a little baby on her lap. And she really was the prototype of a devoted wife and mother, according to this separate spheres idea, even though she was an incredibly powerful woman who was the queen of the British Empire. It's interesting about Queen Victoria. Her husband, Prince Albert, died fairly young, and she was such a devoted wife that every day of her life until her death in 1901, she had the servants set out Prince Albert's clothes on the bed, just like he was going to get up and go to work that day. It's kind of touching, but really shows how she was a role model for these women whose purpose in life was to make life happy and more gentle and softer for their husbands when they came home from a hard day at work. However, some women took this argument and really ran with it in a new direction. Okay, and for women like this, women like Florence Nightingale, who we'll meet later in the course, the founder of the nursing profession, and other women who did get involved with society, their argument went as follows: well, you think I'm more moral, a better person, more ethical than you men? Well, if that's true, isn't it my duty to get out of the house? And not just to take care of my family, but to take care of the society, to try to make society better, more gentle, more livable. And so some women really use this separate spheres idea as a justification for their own activities out in public. And we'll see some more of this, especially with the women's suffrage movement later in the course. Now, with the huge prosperity that was brought to Great Britain by the Industrial Revolution, they were able to embark on a second phase of colonial expansion. Now, you know that the first British Empire was lost in large part with the American Revolution. But this second British Empire that starts really, or it starts in a sense in the late 18th century, but really expands dramatically throughout the 19th century, was quite different from the old empire. So this new imperialism of Great Britain is quite different from the old colonialism. First of all, we saw that Europeans who encountered other cultures during the Enlightenment period often were very intrigued and even admiring of those cultures. That whole idea of the noble savage, that somehow Europeans could even learn from non-white people throughout the world. But in the 19th century, um, the old Enlightenment ideas were swept aside in large part, and new, somewhat scientific ideas began to emerge that seemed to justify racism based on pseudoscientific grounds. For example, some people took the Charles Darwin's theory of evolution and applied it to society. We call these people social Darwinists, and their argument was that just as animal species have to compete to survive in their environment, so the different races of humankind also are in a life and death struggle to see who's going to survive, survival of the fittest, in Darwin's catchphrase. And it was very important to these British imperialists that the white Anglo-Saxon race, the British people, in other words, become and remain the master race. All right, and so that perception of themselves as being superior to all other races, according to the Darwinian theory, or at least the theories of Darwin's followers, would color the British actions in this new colonial empire. Another difference was that even though when they were settling the North American continent, the English had sent large numbers of settlers to America to actually live there, this new British Empire was mostly about trade. And so typically the British would just establish trading outposts in places like India or Southeast Asia or China. And that was really what was important to them. Not at first taking over large portions of land, but just making a killing off trade. However, as time went on, as we'll see, the British were forced, almost against their will at times, to take over huge areas of land, especially in Asia and Africa. So let's pause for this a moment and look at Asia and the effect of the Industrial Revolution on Asia. And here comes this question again: why didn't China, the most advanced nation in the world in the Middle Ages, become the leaders of the modern era? In this context, why didn't they industrialize more than they actually did? Why didn't China become the leaders in the Industrial Revolution? They certainly had the intelligence and they had the money to do it. Well, there were a number of factors. First of all, China, of course, for many years has had the largest population in the world. And that meant that labor was very cheap in China. And so, in a lot of ways, it was cheaper to have poor peasants doing their own traditional tasks in their traditional way, rather than investing large amounts of money in factory equipment so as to improve efficiency. The Chinese really didn't need to improve efficiency; they had plenty of labor. The British, on the other hand, did. They were a small island with a limited population, and so it was very important to them to become as efficient and productive as possible through machinery. Second, business had always been looked down upon in China as a profession. Business people were really placed at the bottom of Chinese society in a very real way. They were scorned. The really intelligent and talented Chinese men wanted to get into the business of government. And so they would study for the civil service exams that would enable them to take their place as government bureaucrats. That was really their goal. And so very few industrious and clever and talented people wanted to go into business. Finally, as we've seen, the Chinese thought they had it all already. So why should they be interested in trade? Why should they be interested in producing large amounts of surplus goods so as to improve their balance of payments with other countries? They didn't really care about that. So they would buy things from the British from time to time, but they didn't bother to produce things to sell around the world so that they would have a better balance of trade. What happened in India? Well, initially the British set up trading posts in India under the leadership of a large business corporation called the British East India Company. But as time went on, this company acquired dominance over large portions of India, and they were able to really reshape the entire economy of India. Now, before British rule, India had been famous for its really beautiful and high quality textile products, and they had sold their their clothing to other countries previously. But under British rule, the Indians were forced to stop producing cloth and instead to focus on producing raw materials, cotton, because that's what colonies were supposed to do. And this really started in earnest during the U.S. Civil War when cotton supplies from the South dwindled, and the British had to turn to India as their main supplier of cotton. Um, and so the effect in India, especially, but also in China, was that whereas before Europeans would spend money in China and India buying silks or textiles or porcelain or tea, um, after the Industrial Revolution, India and to a lesser extent China were buying more things from Europe than they were selling to Europe. And that meant that they became debtor nations. And that meant, in turn, that they lost a lot of leverage in international affairs and became increasingly weak and dependent upon European powers. Well, the British Empire expanded. At one time or another, it included all of the areas that you see on this map in pink, and you see that they're all over the world. At its peak, the British Empire included 25%, one quarter of all the land on the planet Earth. And there was a saying about the British Empire: the sun never sets on the British Empire, because um, somewhere in the world, it's at any moment of the day, the sun was shining on some part of the British Empire. That's how immense and really how extensive it was. A little more about China now. European nations did not actually take over China during this period of imperialism. China remained an independent country ruled by an emperor. Um, but what the European powers did was to create what were called spheres of influence in China, where each country would have special trading privileges so that they could make money off the Chinese people. And we'll come back to this in a second, but just to show you on the map, so you see here that the Japanese had a sphere of influence just to the west of Korea. You see that the French had a sphere of influence in blue just north of their colonies in Indochina, what's now Vietnam, and the other Southeast Asian countries. The Germans had a small sphere of influence, so did the Russians, but the British had essentially a monopoly of trade in much of the southern part of China, and that would prove very momentous for Chinese history in the 19th century, because the British were growing opium, or they were making opium out of the poppy flower in their colonies in India, and they were exporting opium to China and trying to get as many Chinese people as possible hooked on this very powerful drug. Now, what is opium? Nowadays, there are two forms of opium that are widely used. One is a prescription drug that we call morphine, extremely powerful painkiller. The other is the street drug that we call heroin. So you see that this was no joke. I mean, this was very powerful addictive drug that the British were selling to the Chinese people. And they were determined to continue selling it to China. In 1839, the Chinese government really had gotten fed up with this. It was becoming a major social problem in China, opium addiction. In group 3, you're going to read a document by a Chinese official named Commissioner Lin, who was writing to Queen Victoria, begging her to stop selling drugs to his people, which seems like a reasonable demand, doesn't it? I should mention, just to pause, Group 1, you're going to have document by Adam Smith from The Wealth of Nations, very important text that was promoting industrialization, free trade, and the expansion of the economy. Group 2, you're going to have a document by a cotton spinner um, who was complaining about the effects of the factory system on workers. But anyway, back to the opium trade. Well, the British and the Chinese actually went to war over this issue in 1839, and the war lasted for 3 years. And so basically, the British had the most powerful navy in the world. And when the Chinese refused to buy their opium, they simply brought their powerful warships into Chinese ports, and they shelled Chinese cities with their artillery, uh, what was called gunboat diplomacy, and you still hear this term used sometimes in international relations. So basically, the British forced the Chinese to submit to them, forced them to continue buying opium, and in the Treaty of Nanking, after they won the first Opium War, um, the British were given a number of privileges. They were given several special ports where British businessmen could come and sell opium and other things, and they were also given political control of the city of Hong Kong, which Great Britain kept until the year 1999, when they gave Hong Kong back to the People's Republic of China. But this became really the British headquarters in the Far East. There was another Opium War between 1856 and 1860. The British won that one too. And so the Chinese really found themselves helpless to stop themselves from being dominated by business interests from Great Britain and other European countries during the 19th century. Well, I said earlier that the British really didn't intend to take over 25% of the world's land surface. They really just wanted to trade at first. An English writer in the Victorian era named J.R. Seeley commented in 1883, quote, "We seem, as it were, to have conquered and peopled half the world in a fit of absence of mind," end quote. So really, this was almost absent-minded on the British part. They really didn't intend to build this huge empire. So how did it happen? Well, often it would happen because of the realities of power and conflict in the areas that they were trading in. For example, the East India Company, not the British government, controlled large portions of India until the year 1857. Now, the East India Company had its own private army that they used to enforce their demands, and part of the army consisted of native Indians who had volunteered to serve in the East India Company army. These people were called sepoys. But the East India Company made a big mistake in 1857 because they required the sepoys to use cartridges, gun cartridges, that were greased with pork fat. And you had to put this in your mouth, actually, the bullet, before you put it in the gun as part of the process of loading. And both Hindus and Muslims in the army refused to do that. It was against their religious practices. And so they staged a rebellion called the Sepoy Mutiny over this issue. And this was a very bloody revolt. Finally, what happened was the British government had to come in and take over the situation, and they suppressed the Sepoy Mutiny. They executed its leaders using a very gruesome method. You see in the picture here, they tied them to cannons and shot cannonballs through them at point blank range. And then that was when they assumed direct political governance of all of India in 1858 after the Sepoy Mutiny. And so They ruled over India from that point forward until, as we'll see later, the efforts of Mohandas K. Gandhi led to the British departure from India in the 1940s. It should be said, though, that there were very few British people in India, and mostly they relied on the cooperation of Indian natives to help them rule. Another example of the British kind of inadvertently taking over a certain territory happened in Afghanistan in 1880. The British didn't really want Afghanistan, but the Russians looked like they were about to take it over, and the British didn't want the Russians to have it either because that would have threatened India. And so, really, not wanting it very much, the British felt they had to take over Afghanistan, became a British colony, and created a mess which we in the United States have inherited as a legacy of British colonial rule in that country. Another example in 1899 in Nigeria, similar to what happened in India, British business people were working there. They were attacked by the Nigerians, and the British felt they had to send in their army and take over that country to protect their business interests. And so, what you see with the development and growth of the British Empire was that it was often instigated by great British businessmen, men like Cecil Rhodes, who was in the diamond business in southern Africa and almost single handedly established a country called Rhodesia, which is now known as Zimbabwe. But really, British businessmen could become hugely powerful in driving this whole process of colonial and imperial expansion by Great Britain.